The bowl smashed against the marble like a verdict, tomato and garlic flinging across the polished table, and Elena heard the sound of a life she had tried to keep together fracture into a dozen hot, sticky pieces. The baby on her chest stirred, a tiny fist opening and closing as the waitress, white apron trembling, stared at the puddle of sauce as if it were blood. Antonio Moretti's voice cut through the restaurant like a scalpel. "Leave it," he said, flat and cold, and the room inhaled with him. Elena's knees nearly buckled. Luca, Antonio's son, watched with the peculiar hunger of someone born into riches and raised on the geometry of fear. There were eyes on Elena, hungry, calculating, bored. She had only wanted to eat before the clinic closed, to keep the boy's small fever down for one more night. Instead, she had become an act, an interruption in a world whose rules were made to exclude her. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Antonio Moretti did not miss the way the air around Elena tightened when he spoke. He did not miss the desperation at the edges of her laugh when the waitress offered an apology that tasted like the word service recited by someone who had never had to cross a border with a child on her hip. He had come to the restaurant for a show of civility, a rare public dinner meant to teach his son how to sit still while the world bowed or bent or broke. He found instead a small, furious dignity he had tried to name and bury. The baby smelled faintly of boiled milk and rust. Elena's hair was pulled back with a wire, and her hands were cracked in the way of someone who kneaded bread and counted pills in unequal portions. Antonio's chest tightened, not from hunger or anger, but something older and more treacherous: recognition. Luca traced the rim of his glass with a finger, trying to look casual. He was at the cusp of adolescence, neither fully boy nor nearly man, his face still soft where Antonio's had already hardened. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, voice underlined with curiosity and a fragile morality. Luca wanted to believe his father was a nobleman of a strange court where rules were iron and never personal. He watched the exchange as if it were a puzzle, each piece a lesson in what power could and could not erase. Antonio's answer was a look, one measured, old as war, and a little weary. "Because charity without consequence is how empires rot," he said, and the waiter who had been hovering swallowed. Elena gathered herself, tucking the baby closer without taking her eyes off the man who had told the staff to leave it. It was not shame she wore, but a stubborn, exhausted pride. "I'll pay for it," she murmured, before the waitress could protest. Her voice was a thread, but there was iron beneath it. The room seemed to tilt. In a city that paid attention the way the poor might, she had made the mistake of announcing that she would pay for something she could not afford. Antonio's captain, a wide-shouldered man named Rocco, let his smile harden into a warning. In the world of Moretti, deaths had a color. That night, Antonio left something on the car seat he had not planned to leave: an envelope, thick with cash, with no name, and an old coin pressed on top like a talisman. He didn't hand it to Elena. He slipped it into the coat of a young waiter who was finishing his shift, and nodded once. The kind of gesture that could take a small life and make it easier. He told himself the money was for the bowl and the trouble, nothing more than clearing a stain before it set. But in the dark, when he drove his son back across the river where the buildings leaned like tired men, the city laid itself bare in neon and shadow, and the envelope in the coat of a stranger burned like a confession in his palm. Elena found the envelope 3 days later under a stack of delivery slips in the cramped bakery where she worked mornings and took in odd jobs at night. She had thought the Moretti world would never touch hers, except to ignore it, like a tide that receded was still powerful enough to reshape the shore. She tore open the paper with a small prayer and found enough cash to quiet the clinic for the month and pay for the antibiotics the doctor said would keep Matteo's lungs from giving out before the winter. She had never felt the shame of a gift so sharp. It made her hands tremble and her anger flare. Someone had decided for her. Someone had seen her hunger and thought it could be fixed with numbers. She should have left it at that. A hand that fixes, an anonymous kindness that accepted no bridge. Instead, she did the only reckless thing left to a woman who had been performing small miracles out of necessity. She wrote a thank you note and left it folded beneath the sugar canister on the bakery counter, not signed, simply, "For the nights my son sleeps because someone paid. Thank you." It was more than a note, it was a beacon. Antonio did not expect to read it. He picked it up during his next unannounced visit to the cafe, that disguise, a simple cap and scarf, and for a moment the handwriting pulled him toward a memory he had kept locked away. His mother's ink-stained hands, begging once for mercy and getting a slap instead. His heart, the part he had wrapped in steel and treaties, gave a tiny, traitorous leap. Word of the incident spread through the underbelly like a rumor that tasted like trouble. In a neighborhood where helping could be coded as weakness, where kindness could be bought and turned to leverage, Antonio's anonymous act rewired something in the room. His lieutenants noticed the way his attention shortened that week. He took late-night walks without his captains, returned with the faint smell of yeast or something sweet on his coat. Rocco's eyes narrowed. "You're soft," Rocco said once over a table that held too many cigars and too few truths. His accusation landed like a gauntlet. The men who had built the Moretti map saw softness as a fissure waiting to be widened by knives. Luca began to watch his father through a different lens. Curiosity curdled with suspicion. Why was his father visiting bakeries? How did the man who once taught him to tie a tie with military patience now take the time to ask the baker about the flour? Luca followed the pattern like an apprentice detective, cataloging small acts for a larger theory. He asked questions that were half challenge, half plea. "Do you ever wish someone just came and fixed things?" Luca asked one evening during a drive that smelled of gasoline and river water. Antonio's hands tightened on the wheel. There were things fathers were allowed to fix, loyalty, fear, and others they could not, without destroying the system they had built. Elena tried to live as if the money she'd been given had been a coincidence. She pretended to be practical, folding the bills into the till and paying the clinic. Yet at night she replayed the moment in the restaurant when Antonio had softened, not outwardly, not in concessions, but in the way a muscle near his eye twitched. She clung to a stubborn principle that would not let her take what felt like a charity that erased dignity. Acceptance in her world looked like bargaining, like reciprocity. She wrote a second note and tucked it into a loaf of bread destined for a hungry neighbor. Inside, a small card with a message that read like a dare. "If this is charity, I refuse it. Meet me at dawn behind the clinic." Antonio read the second note at dawn, watching the city blink awake from the windows of a car that hummed like a beast he barely controlled. Her words were a challenge, not an invitation. He wanted to answer with power, a language he had honed, but the choice before him was not a tactical move he could approve or deny. It was an invitation to stay human in a life that had outlawed softness. He wanted to be the kind of man who could fix things without cost, who could arrange for a factory to run or a hospital to bend, and still be revered. But the more he tried to imagine the ledger of favors and debts, the more the ledger began to weigh on him. That ledger was a map whose borders were marked by blood. When he met her behind the clinic at dawn, Elena smelled of yeast and rain and a tired, bright defiance. Matteo, asleep in his sling, was a small, fragile treaty between her and the world. Antonio stood too straight, the suit too sharp for the gray of the alley, his hands in his pockets like a man trying to hide thunder. They spoke in guarded sentences at first. He called himself a businessman, something vague and safe. She called him sir and then stopped, correcting herself with a frank, bewildered smile that made him want to tell the truth and also be entirely silent. There was something in the way she refused to lower her eyes that chiseled at the last of his pretense. He offered her money again, awkward and clumsy. She refused, and he found that he could not simply leave her refusal. "Why won't you take what you need?" he asked finally. The question not tactical but honest, in a way his life rarely permitted. Elena's gaze flicked to his hands, to the way his knuckles whitened around an invisible ledger. "Because I've lived off what people felt sorry enough to give," she said. "I won't take pity. I won't let my boy sleep on charity." Her voice broke like a rule and then reassembled. Antonio wanted to argue that charity was practical, a kind of insurance he could afford. Instead, he felt ridiculous and raw, like a man who had just realized his hands could also make bread and not just take it. They did not leave knowing the shape of the thing between them. They left with the map of future dangers tucked into the corners of their mouths. A man like Antonio carries enemies like a shadow. Elena's refusal to be rescued sat in his chest like a foreign object he could not ignore. By the time the sun rose over the roofs, both had made choices that would begin to unthread the seams of their lives. Antonio had chosen to look twice at the people his empire touched. Elena had chosen to trust a stranger's envelope and then to refuse the terms of its surrender. Outside, the alley smelled of damp newspapers, yeast, and river cold, ordinary things that, once rearranged by decisions, could tilt the world. Antonio's visits became a rhythm that the neighborhood felt before they named it. He arrived alone more often than not, a shadow slipping into the bakery before the ovens had fully warmed, ordering an espresso that he left half drunk because he preferred the taste of listening. He watched Elena with a focus that was almost rude in its intensity. The tilt of her jaw when she stretched dough, the way she hummed under her breath to soothe Matteo, the quick, economical movements that kept the bakery alive on pennies and grit. He learned small, unnecessary things. The precise beat of her hands when she needed, the habit of tucking stray hair behind an ear when a customer arrived with a question. Luca, impatiently curious and increasingly resentful, began to turn those visits into a private study. He watched the way the light fell on his father's face when he stood close enough to see Elena's profile and not far enough to be called a coward by his father's men. Rocco's voice pushed like a tide against Antonio's new current. "You don't wander into people's lives without a reason," Rocco said one night in the back room where men in suits surrendered cigarettes to the dark. "It makes us weak." There was more than accusation in his tone. There was hunger. For the territory Antonio's distraction might loosen. For the favors men in other neighborhoods would trade for the smell of insecurity. Antonio's answer was the same old thing he had given all his life, a promise without details. "I'm watching," he said, which was both true and a way of not saying anything at all. Luca didn't listen the way the men did. He listened like someone trying to assemble a moral compass from live parts. He would linger outside the bakery, on an errand that could have been done in 5 minutes, watching Elena cajole a delivery boy or comfort a frightened neighbor. He saw the way she hid worry in her apron and the way she refused help that smelt like pity. He began to bring home small loaves, claiming them as his own discoveries, as if pilfering bread might be a way to hold two truths, allegiance to his father and a tenderness for the world his father's power erased. The more Luca observed, the more his certainties cracked. He tested his father with questions that were not polite. He asked about consequences and mercy, about the ledger of favors, about whether a man who controlled a city's pulse could also carry gentleness without it becoming a weakness. Meanwhile, Elena lived as if the envelope had been a stone thrown into a pool. The ripples were inevitable, and she refused to calculate their end. She continued to barter, to fold rationed flour in ways that stretched, to stitch extra shifts into a body already mapped by exhaustion. Yet she also began to keep a list in the lining of her apron: the clinic's next bill, the prescription due, the neighbor who needed sugar. Small economies of care, arranged with the sort of love that made her hands ache in the mornings. When Antonio's visits increased, she felt a new kind of exposure. Not the raw indignity of being watched by a predator, but the strange unsteadiness of being seen by someone who could erase the discomfort with a stroke of a pen. Her pride bristled at the thought. Pride had kept her upright when the landlord's knock had become a rumor. Pride had kept Mateo's room from being empty of pictures. She was neither a spectacle nor a victim. She was a woman refusing to be enclosed by the narrowness of pity. Rumor, like rot, found its way into places someone didn't want it. The Moretti men began to speak in quiet tones that sounded like knives. "He hands out money at bakeries now," one lieutenant said, amusement fueled by dread. "To single mothers, to clinic bills." The joke was bitter. Antonio had always been a man who led by setting the terms. Giving without a bill was a kind of defection, an unrehearsed act that made others nervous because it could not be tallied. In houses where survival depended on knowing the cost of every favor, a free gift was a power wielded without consent. Rocco watched his capo with the patient fury of a man who could see a line forming and could not, would not, be left behind. In the bakery, Elena noticed changes as well. Customers who had been casual now watched the man who came in with the same financial certainty of a bank and then left as if he had invented desire. Some people whispered, maybe she had a backer, maybe she was laundering favors for some other crew. In a city that thrived on suspicion, such whispers were seeds that would grow thorns. Elena resented the attention because it came free of dignity. She had no interest in being a pawn, an emblem of goodwill, or an unpaid debt. She wanted work that respected the weight of her hands and a life where her son could cough through a night without her hand shaking and without strangers inventing stories about her. Antonio felt the net closing from the inside. A careful man, he recalibrated strategies he had once believed immovable. He created routines so that his generosity could be defended as something else. He began to commission public works, to fund a clinic's wing anonymously in the press as philanthropy from a shadow corporation, to hold a fundraiser that declared his name in an elegant ink. But his private visits did not stop. He found reasons to be in the neighborhood, an inspection of a property, a negotiation with vendors. His closeness to Elena was no longer purely transactional. It became a presence that complicated his strategies. He fell into the habit of walking Mateo to the clinic when a fever flared, hands in his pockets, watching the mother who refused to be bought. The costs of crossing lines are never solely moral. They are often practical and immediate. A rival crew, the Santoris, who had long eyed Moretti territory with a predator's patience, noticed the flutter in the Moretti ranks. Their lieutenant, a wiry man with a permanent sneer named Paolo, sensed an opportunity and sent a thin, polite warning. His men had seen Antonio's face in a bakery, Paolo said, and in the understatement of the underworld, understatement is a blade. People who blend in are hard to hit, Paolo told a friend in a bar that smelled of spilled beer and old grudges. But men who go soft are easy to push. He did not know or refuse to know that Antonio's softness was not weakness, but a different kind of loss. A man mourning what he had never allowed himself to protect, an ordinary life. Elena's past, small and brittle as sugar, became the kindling that men with ambitions liked to set alight. A courier once employed her for a short time, a shadow of proximity that Paulo's men magnified into a story. Elena the courier, Elena the informant, Elena the spy. The story was false, exaggerated to a delicious level, but it fit the city's appetite for easy narratives. The rumor reached Rocco in a whisper that tasted like smoke. Rocco's jaw clenched. Accusations now had the color of sales. A woman in a bakery had been seen near a van that rolled with Centauri plates. In a world where alliances were bridges built of oversight and suspicion, proximity could be weaponized. Antonio heard the whispers and felt, cold and real, the hands of his men tighten around old rules. He thought he could deflect them with more charity, with more public generosity. But the law of the streets is that the kindness of kings does not placate hunger, it incites it. Luca's unease began to fray into something sharper. He saw the way Rocco watched his father, not for weakness, but for an opening. He recognized the tactical silence in the men who were careful to keep their hands near flashing knives. He had watched more than he had known, cataloged more than he had admitted. One night, he followed his father to a meeting where Antonio intended to rebalance loyalties, to whisper that priorities had shifted, and to stress that the city was not a house to be sold to the highest bidder. Luca slipped through shadows, hungry for proof that his father's mercy was not foolishness. He heard words that tasted like betrayal. "He's distracted. We need a clean message. If he won't act, someone will." The crisis that had been simmering arrived with a small, precise cruelty. Paulo's men ambushed a Moretti restock van on a side street that had once been neutral and cracked the skull of a driver who had been family to Rocco. The attack was not grandiose. It was a reminder, a careful bruise left to be examined. Moretti men retaliated with measured force. A storefront smashed, a Centauri courier roughed up. But the eyes of Antonio's lieutenants had shifted. They were searching not for the man who had ordered retaliation. They were searching for the man who had shown his face in public for reasons they could not monetize. They called him soft in tones that were meant to wound, but the word hit like an accusation that unpeeled the true vulnerability. Any public affection, any unaccounted kindness made the rest of them question the integrity of the chain. Elena found herself dragged unwillingly into the collision. A Centauri hanger-on, half resentful and all opportunist, began to tail the bakery with the gusto of a man hoping for leverage. He photographed deliveries, took notes about who came and went, and passed the scraps along until they landed in Paulo's hands. Paulo's men painted the photographs around their table like a map of an irresistible target. There was a pleasure in it, a cruelty that felt like amusement. The Moretti boss had a weakness for a baker. What a thing to exploit! The plan was small but smartly vicious. To use Elena as bait to create a scene that would force Antonio into a choice that would either betray his own code or plunge the neighborhood into fire. Good plans in the underworld are rarely complicated. They rely on predictable human reactions. One afternoon, having finally worked up the nerve to ask for an explanation without the theater of a dawn meeting, Elena confronted Antonio. The bakery was empty, the oven cooled. Matteo slept in a sling against her chest, his breath even and warm. He was her whole argument and her softest clause. She spoke with the urgency of someone who had counted the future and found it too small. "You have to stop sending people," she said. "You have to stop interfering." Antonio's response was not the blunt instrument she expected. For once, he did not try to shield his motives with abstract language or the pretense of capitalism. He simply said, "I didn't think it would make a difference if I saw you without my suit." She laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "You don't need a suit to make trouble. You need a name." He flinched. The truth was a blow. Names, in their world, were leverage. She said what she had been too proud to confess. "If they come to your world for me, I won't be safe here, and I won't let my son be a bargaining chip. That evening, Paolo's men made their move. They staged a noisy argument outside the bakery, a planned insult thrown so it could be caught, a man loudly accusing Elena of being connected, a staged whisper about Moretti's new interest in the neighborhood. Someone tried to shove Matteo from a stroller, a pretend scuffle that would have been comic if it had not been cruel. The plan worked in the way predators hope it will. It prompted witnesses, it prompted questions, and, most dangerously, it prompted a reaction. The neighborhood closed like a fist. Elena's heartbeat became a bell, rapid, impossible to turn off. She realized, with a clarity that was both cold and cutting, that nothing she had tried to build with careful hands could withstand being turned into currency. Antonio arrived at the bakery to find a crowd, a man on his feet having his voice and his lies polished by the crowd's hunger. He moved fast and without the elegant cruelty of boardroom decisions. He moved like a father, displacing himself, not a capo, but a man who recognized the exact vulnerability of a small body sleeping against another. Men who had followed him into wars and quiet nights watched him with a mix of admiration and worry. He put himself between the threat and the woman who had refused his help and then refused to be the quiet beneficiary of it. The air smelled of burnt flour and river rain. His chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the rawness of a man who had been raised to see mercy as a liability. The confrontation did not explode into gunfire, not yet. But Paolo had left a clear message. He could humiliate, he could bait, and he was clever enough not to start a war he couldn't finish. The balance had shifted. Antonio's men now suspected his motives. Paolo had learned how to poke at the soft underbelly of a man who was more complicated than his legend. And Elena, who had wanted only to be left alone, now held in her hands the fragile cause of a battle she had not wished for. The stakes were no longer simply territorial. They had become personal in the most devastating way. They threatened the tender architecture of human affection crouched so carefully beneath an empire of fear. At the end of that night, as the city settled and the bakery closed early with locks and prayers, Luca hovered on the stoop, watching his father and the woman with a swelling inside him that could be pride or shame. He had seen his father move to protect without thinking of consequence. He had seen mercy act like violence, and violence act like mercy, and the lines between them blur until he could not tell one from the other. The nascent lesson he had been accumulating, that power and tenderness are not mutually exclusive, now rang with a danger that tasted like iron. He knew that something had been set in motion that could not be easily stopped, a chain reaction that began with an envelope and had dragged an entire city into a gamble whose payoff was not money, but the fragile possibility of something like redemption. They would all have to choose how far to go to protect what they had found, brittle and beautiful. A woman's dignity, a child's sleep, a father's buried tenderness. The choice would be public, dangerous, and irreversible. The push and pull of it tightened like a rope around all their throats, and the next move would decide whether the rope became a lifeline or a noose. They came for her the morning the bakery's window fogged with rain and the world outside looked like a painting left in the rain. Elena had just set a tray of still warm rolls on the counter when a squad of uniforms, 2 in the patched dark of municipal police and 3 men in plain clothes with smiles that failed to reach their eyes, arrived as if summoned by a wronged neighborhood. Matteo, groggy from a night of fever, slept against her chest in a sling that smelled of flour and milk. The plainclothes man, who carried the forward posture of someone used to making good things go away, stepped up and slapped a photograph on the glass. A grainy image of Elena by a van, a timestamp that looked doctored, a caption that read, "Elena Moretti, Associate." The paper trembled in the rain like a flapping flag. Orders, the uniform said, voice neutral and practiced. "We need to ask a few questions." The men moved with the thoroughness of predators who had practiced the choreography of ruin. They did not shout, they did not threaten, because they did not have to. The bakery filled in that small, terrifying way a life does when something real begins to be undone. Neighbors edged toward the windows, faces drawn tight, gossip held like a thing that needed careful cutting. Elena's hands were steady, a betrayal and a truth. She wiped a crust of flour into the palm of her apron and looked at the photograph as if it were a lie she could peel away. The plainclothes man had the terrible ease of someone who knew how to use the law as a hammer. "You worked for a courier line," he said. "We have testimony that you were paid to pass messages." Elena's laugh when it came was small and dry as a bone. "I delivered bread and once a message. Once," she said, the confession squeezed so brief from a pocket of shame she had not planned to open. She had been young and hungry. A courier had offered cash then, not knowing he was asking more than a favor. It had seemed harmless until the city taught them all what proximity could buy. Someone in the corner, an old woman who had been taking a seat by the window for years, muttered, "You shouldn't have mixed with that crowd, girl." The words landed like a verdict. Mateo stirred. His skin burned slightly with fever. Elena swallowed. She had counted the cost of every choice until the numbers ran out, and now choices were being counted for her. The uniform produced a list of names and a cold, bureaucratic logic: witness statements, sightings, bank transfers. The plainclothes man smiled and told her it would be easier if she cooperated. The word cooperate in their mouths was elastic. It could mean confession, relocation, or a story that fit a file. Elena felt the room shrink until the sky over the bakery was only a strip of gray. Her pride, which had kept her upright through evictions and sleepless nights, dared not to betray her fear. Outside, Paulo's men watched from across the street with the gleeful patience of hunters who have called the wolves. They did not need to shout victory. The law would do their work in neat paperwork and blinking lights. A message had been delivered, and their small, savage experiment into human leverage had borne fruit. It was clean, smart cruelty. Bring the civic state into the scene and let it do what thugs could not do without dirtying their hands. Antonio heard about the arrests the way he heard bad weather approaching, a pressure that bent the bones of the city. The news arrived in the form of a single text from a man he had once paid to hold things together, a line of code that read like a challenge. Elena taken. He felt something like an animal pain in his chest that was older than strategy, older than rage, a bone-deep dread for a child he had not sired and a woman who had refused to be pitied. He could smell the injustice in the air like something that wanted to be righted, and he knew the cost of action. He moved through the underworld as if on maps he'd drawn with his hands. He expected Rocco to be waiting in the back room, the cigarette smoke like an offering to arguments. Rocco, who had once kept a ledger of loyalty like a priest keeps scripture, looked at him with the tired, clear fury of a man betrayed. "You brought the law to us," Rocco said. "You walked into the bakery yourself. Now you come back with blood on your hands and expect us to trace what you did." Antonio's voice was a low instrument. "I didn't bring the law," he said. "I brought the chance that a life might be different." Rocco's laugh did not find mirth. It found something like the last straw. "Difference?" he echoed. "In this life, difference is what gets people eaten by the street. We don't buy others' choices, boss. We control them or we don't. You've set a precedent." Luca watched this, his young face drawn with a seriousness that nearly made him older than he was. He had followed his father that night to the meeting he had overheard, A boy wanting to understand the man in the suit who could command men and still fail at home. He had seen Rocco's jaw tighten like a fist, and his father choose a kind of silence that excluded him. He felt the building blocks of reverence shift beneath him. The admiration he had held for the man who could move ink and men now smelled of smoke. They went to the precinct where Elena had been held. The fluorescent lights there made everyone look like they were being dissected. The plainclothes officer who had smiled at the bakery now operated in a different key, professional, implacable. He offered Antonio a ledger of possibilities. Cooperation yields release. Evidence requires investigation. And there was the small caveat of a favor the city might require later if one wanted eyes closed now. Antonio did not like favors wrapped in law. He liked them wrapped in gold or threat. This was a hybrid he had not invited. Elena sat on a chair that was too hard for sleep and too thin for comfort. Mateo's fever had spiked. The nurse who had been allowed limited access frowned at the child and wrote in a book with the slow hand of someone who had seen too many sad patterns. Elena's eyes were tired but bright, in that specific way someone's eyes go when they refuse to be erased. "I had a job," she said, low to the interrogator. "I delivered packages to a man who paid for flour. It was work." He listened with a patience that was professional and an appetite that was not. The recorder hummed like a tiny witness. He offered her words like flakes of sugar. "If you say what we want, there will be leniency." Paulo's men watched from a distance and exulted at the way small ruin could be engineered. Their plan required no shot fired, no blaring trumpets, only the slow patience of bureaucracy and the lure of self-preservation. Elena could save herself by telling the story the police wanted, or she could refuse and let the weight of suspicion expand until it crushed the bakery under indictments and fines. She knew what betrayal tasted like, and she knew what refusing it would cost. At the bakery's door, Rocco's men loitered like a second shadow, watchful, suspicious. They had begun to drink from the cup that Antonio had brewed. Now they wondered if there was lead in the bottom. Antonio, who could have burned half a neighborhood and justified it with a ledger, felt the more ruinous pull, the knowledge that brutality would save the body of the family, but ruin the secret tenderness he was cultivating. He had the authority to make Elena vanish into a safe house, to exile her with new papers, and pay every medical bill until winter melted into spring. He did not distrust the law so much as he feared its weaponization by minds like Paulo's, men who could turn any mercy into evidence of weakness. He had always calculated, and he now had to calculate a way to be humane without making decoys of the people he claimed to respect. The fracture that blew open was intimate and ineffably human. A man who had once been an ally brought a rumor to the room. Elena had taken gifts beyond the envelope. She had accepted money and now functioned as a pivot between rival crews. Rocco's face went ashen. Luca's hands clenched. The rumor unspooled into a list of transactions that were real, small, hidden cash exchanges of a woman who had once accepted a courier's help, but were reframed into treason. The ledger that men like Rocco kept on people included margins for treachery and for loyalty. Elena's name entered those margins as a stain. Antonio had intended to protect. Instead, his action had become the thread the city used to weave its accusation. His men, faithful, hungry, human, looked at him as if he had started a game they could not win. In their eyes, he saw a question he had not wanted to earn. Was he acting like a capo or like a man with a broken heart? The two were not mutually exclusive, and that truth made his lieutenants dizzy with fear. A capo with a soft spot was bad calculus. A capo who acted without consensus was worse.
Elena's release hinged on a decision that would be read like a verdict: cooperate with the police and name the couriers who had once given her work, or hold her dignity and risk a charge that would make her life into an exhibit. She looked at Matteo and thought of the nights of coughing and the nights of counting coins. She thought of the envelope and the man who had left it, of the way he had tried to be kind without asking. She thought, too, of the men who prowled near her bakery who might turn her refusal into a brand on her forehead.
She realized, with a particular clarity that felt like being stripped bare, that she had been a pawn in a pageant she had not agreed to participate in. Antonio executed a move that was as much fracture as it was mercy. He stood in the precinct and said nothing of confession. Instead, he offered a name as collateral, a small corporation that had ostensibly laundered money for health clinics, charities, and public toilets. It was a bluff that took hours to be tested. It was also a necessary distraction, a legal stone thrown into the machinery of the city that bought time. Rocco watched him with a terror that was part admiration, part fury. Paolo watched him, amused and unafraid. The law clerk took the documents and asked to verify signatures. But time is not neutral in streets where rumors grow like mold. For every hour Antonio bought with paper and shadow, a new gossip took root. The boss had been seen in the bakery. The boss had meddled. The boss had compromised the family. Luca, who had followed his father's movements like a son who wanted a map, felt the map burn. He had watched his father choose the part of himself that loved things ordinary and tender. And now that tenderness had translated into a public cost he could not reconcile with the violent charisma that had shaped their lives. He stepped away that night, angry and confused, a boy whose certainties had been shattered. Elena was released on bail that smelled like oil and coin. She returned to the bakery with the bruise of suspicion half healed but still raw. The neighborhood greeted her with the polite cruelty of those who had seen pity and decided it was contagious. Matteo's fever dipped, then spiked again. The clinic that had been paid for by an unnamed packet of bills hummed along with electricity that might be cut at any time. Elena had survived a public humiliation, but the scaffolding of her life had been compromised. Customers hushed, men watched, and the food that once sustained her tasted faintly of danger. That night, as locks clicked and the city murmured in its ways, Antonio sat alone in a room thick with smoke and cold. The fracture lines had less to do with the enemy's threat and more with the interior of his family. His men doubted him, his son admired him and resented him in the same breath, and the woman who had been the reason for his new tenderness had been thrown into the machinery of punishment. He had believed that an act of kindness could be private. He had not foreseen how an anonymous mercy would become a public battlefield. Across the river, Luca lay awake, replaying the sequence he understood as betrayal. He had followed his father into rooms where men made decisions and felt for the first time the bitter tidings of power. To be loved by the man who ruled was not a gift, it was a risk. He thought of Elena's hands, of Matteo's small chest, and of the envelope that had begun it all. He thought of a father who had taught him to make choices and then made a choice that left his son unmoored. In the bakery, Elena sat on the back steps and cradled Matteo, watching the boy's breath rise and fall like a small tide. She had fought for dignity and found it complicated by intervention. She had wanted nothing but to be left alone to mend a life that had been patched together with thrift and stubbornness. Now her life was louder, shadowed by interest she had not invited. She thought of the man who had left the envelope and of a cap and scarf that had been intended to hide thunder. She loved the idea that someone might tip the balance in their favor. She hated the cost with the fierceness of a woman whose pride was the spine of her child's survival. When the moon left its silver on the river, all three, Antonio, Elena, and Luca sat with fractures that could not be smoothed by apologies. The next move would not be small. The city, with Paolo's men and Rocco's anger, with the police's bureaucratic appetite and a neighborhood's gossip, hung poised like a loaded breath. The question remained, who would break first? Who would make the sacrifice that would decide whether the kindness started with an envelope could survive the violence it had invited? The fractures were not merely of politics or territory. They had leapt into the tender chambers where love might be possible. And that is where they would hurt the most. Antonio decided, with the kind of clarity that arrives when a man finally feels the tremor in a structure he once believed unshakable, that he would not let a woman he barely knew be ground beneath the gears of his life. Not because he wanted to prove something to Rocco or to the Centaurs, but because the thought of Matteo's small chest lurching without a hand to steady it made the ledger in his head tilt toward a different calculation. Some debts were not counted in coin. He would pay with currency he had never believed proper to spend, not money, but surrender. He would trade a piece of the machine he had built for the one thing it could not buy. Peace for a child, and the chance for a woman to live without being traded like an asset. He called Luca to his side, the boy's face still carrying the shadow of the night when the precinct had hummed with fluorescent accusation. "You will see how hard things must sometimes be," Antonio said, and the words were a contract both of love and of pedagogy. He signed papers that morning that would be read as a strategic recalibration. He relinquished several of his front-facing businesses, the kind that laundered influence under the clean banner of civic improvement, and publicly transferred them to a trust with a visible board that included municipal names and his rival's chosen mediators. It was theater for the cameras and sacrament for his enemies. In effect, he was carving away a sliver of the empire to make a safer island for those he wanted to protect. It was a bitter, tactical cut. Rocco cursed the decision as if Antonio had cut a limb from his own body. "You give up the storefronts and expect us to follow your heart?" He spat in a smoke-stained room where men measured loyalty by blood pressure. But to the men who had built the Moretti scaffolding with bared knuckles, Antonio's move read as concession. He knew they would interpret it as weakness, which is why he made sure the act had teeth. The trust's language included protections, payroll guarantees for Moretti men who would be reassigned, and a clause that ensured the bakery and the clinic would be gifted operational autonomy under community trusteeship. A legal buffer that made it harder for Paolo to spin Elena's life into leverage. The gamble was audacious because it asked men who lived by iron to accept something softer. It asked enemies to trust paper where they trusted bullets. Paolo scoffed. He enjoyed the idea of an enemy unmade by balance sheets. "You hand them a bakery and call it peace?" he sneered, thinking the move theatrical and impotent. He did not yet understand that Antonio had never intended the surrender to be passive. It was a closing of a loop that required a new kind of courage. While Antonio negotiated with lawyers and men in suits who smelled of litigation rather than rum, Luca performed perhaps the more radical act of becoming the sort of son his father had not taught him to be. He went to the bakery every day with no pretense of espionage. He carried flour sacks when Elena allowed it, letting his hands learn the burn of honest labor. He tethered himself to Matteo with a clumsy affection that made Elena's chest ache and softened Antonio in a way that bled into his decisions. Luca learned to watch without cataloging. He learned the difference between power that takes and power that protects. The Centaurus retaliated, of course. The underbelly doesn't appreciate being recalibrated. Paolo set an ambush on a late-night delivery that was supposed to be a test. A coded shipment of appliances for the Trust's community kitchen. Men who once worked for Moretti now moving under the Trust's logo. It was meant to interrupt the narrative Antonio was spinning and reassert the deliciously simple power of fear.
The ambush was violent in a way that was efficient. The men attacked to wound, not to exterminate, leaving the trust's convoys scarred but functional. The message was clear. Paper could be shredded, rage could not. Antonio fought back with a decision that was both humble and public. He did not call for an all-out war. The cost would be lives and ruin he could not stomach. But he walked into the square before Paulo's men like a man who had decided that the only way to end the baiting was to take exposure as payment for safety. He stood with Luca at his side and the bakery's sign in the background, and he made an appeal to the city's faces that were tired and hungry. He denounced the violence publicly, invited the press to witness the trust's mission, and offered Paulo a mediated meeting, a risky, brave move that placed his chest upon the blade. The cameras ate the moment. The city watched as the man who had built fear with iron now built refuge with paper. Paulo, who had banked on the Moretti name to frighten and entertain the street, was forced into a theater he had not arranged.
He came to the meeting with lawyers and men who fancied themselves diplomats. Antonio did not offer to placate him with profit. He offered him the alternative of irrelevance. "You can keep bullying corners," Antonio said quietly, voice like gravel and river. "Or you can sit across from me and take a cut of something that lasts longer than headlines." He spoke in terms Paolo could understand: money, influence, presence. But he also made a promise that there would be consequences for anyone who used civilians as bait. Paolo laughed, then signed paper that made him accountable to a mediator Antonio had chosen, a magistrate who had long preferred quiet settlements to headlines. The climax came not with the ring of a gun, but with the kind of sacrifice that scars in a different register. Antonio knew he could not simply rearrange businesses and expect loyalties to hold. He needed a proof that his gesture was not mere performance. So he surrendered a personal fiefdom he had long clung to, a warehouse on the river where Moretti men stashed goods and memories, where favors had been traded and secrets kept. He handed over its keys to the trust, but not before he staged a final act that felt less like loss and more like atonement. He walked the empty rooms with Luca and Elena, the three of them in the echoing space, and told Luca what sacrifices looked like when they were not about reputation, but about saving a life. "I will not let your hands be used for my ledger," he said to Elena in the cold air, and his voice wavered because it was the first time he had spoken without the scaffolding of authority. Elena, who had learned to protect pride as easily as she protected Matteo, felt her defenses crumble like thin sugar under heat. "You don't have to be mine to be safe," he added, a phrase that carried both an admission and a plea. Elena looked at him, and for a moment the city paused. She saw a man who had been taught to punish weakness now choose it as a weapon for good. She saw a father who had torn the fabric of his son's certainty, remake it into a tapestry that included tenderness. She accepted a new kind of hand extended not as ownership but as partnership, a legal scaffolding around her bakery, a paid nurse for Matteo, a fund for medicine managed by a committee she would sit on. The exchange was not charity in the old sense. It was a redistribution that acknowledged dignity. Rocco, furious and bruised, watched the papers being signed and felt the world slip along a new axis. Some men would leave in disgust. Others would stay and learn how to fold softness into order. The choice would splinter the Moretti family into factions that might fight another day. But for tonight, the ledger balanced towards saving a life. Paolo, watching his plan dissolve into something more durable, slunk away with the sort of wounded pride that breeds future schemes. He had been beaten at his own game because Antonio refused to be baited into open aggression and instead changed the rules on the field. That night, the bakery smelled of warm bread and salt air that drifted up from the river. Matteo slept under a light that did not flicker, his fever damped by medicine that came with a paper trail rather than a secret envelope. Elena cradled him, exhausted and raw and impossibly tender. Luca, whose respect for his father had cracked and been remade, sat on the counter with hands sticky from dough and eyes that were older and kinder. Antonio watched them all and felt a kind of peace that was not perfect. It was expensive, fraught, and immediate. He had given up control and, in doing so, had claimed himself in a way the ledger never could. He did not expect miracles. He expected consequences. But as the oven cooled and the city hummed like a beast that had been fed for a night, something like a family, messy, negotiated, scarred, gathered under one socket of light. Antonio placed a loaf on the counter and let his fingers linger on the crust. Elena reached out, not in surrender, but in recognition. Luca closed the small distance between them and rested his head on his father's shoulder. It was not a clean victory. It was a risky, human reclaiming. Outside, the river flowed indifferent to bargains and promises. Inside, the three of them sat with the knowledge that redemption in a world built on fear requires a kind of reckoning that tastes like surrender and like bread. They lingered there until the street outside went quiet enough to hear the city's slow breathing, the hum of a truck far off, the river's constant, indifferent susurration. The bakery's light was a small domestic cathedral. The oven cast long, forgiving shadows. Antonio found himself performing a gesture he would once have called useless. He washed his hands at the sink, the steam rising like a small confession. The act was ordinary, and because of that, it felt like salvation. Elena watched him, not with the wary calculation she'd practiced like armor, but with the careful curiosity of someone cataloging a weather change. "You could leave," she said softly, the sentence a question and an offering. Antonio's laugh was a thin thing, but not cruel. "I don't know how," he admitted. It was the truth of men who have been forged in one identity and then offered another. He had learned to command storms. He had not yet learned how to be present in the small, molten things that make a home. Luca folded himself into the space between them with an awkwardness that was almost tender. He had been the boy who observed and judged. Now he was the son who wanted to learn how to belong without a manual. "Teach me to need," he said before he could censor it, and the plea was childish and devastating. Elena's face softened. She handed him a flowered apron as if passing along a small, private oath. Their hands met over the dough, a clumsy choreography that taught patience and the economy of warmth. Antonio watched them, and for the first time in a long time, the ledger in his head quieted. The sums he had once used to measure loyalty had been replaced by something less tidy, a rhythm of mornings and the small business of keeping a child alive. Outside, the city continued to arrange itself in compromises. Rocco vanished into nights that would be filled with hard choices. Some men left with dignity, others stayed with a new kind of wariness. Paolo retreated into the dark corners that breed new plots. But inside the bakery, where light pooled and bread cooled on racks, a different bargain had been struck, one less visible and perhaps more dangerous, because it demanded daily fidelity rather than a single heroic act. They ate a loaf between them, breaking bread the way people do when they are negotiating the terms of a fragile peace. Matteo stirred and opened his eyes, a small, bright inquiry that rewired the room. Antonio reached out without thinking and tucked a crumb from the boy's lip with a gentleness that surprised them both. Elena let out a breath she had been holding for years, a small sound like a key turning in a lock. Luca leaned his head against his father's shoulder, as if trying on the weight of connection and finding it fit, imperfect and real. When the night finally loosened its hold and the first flat light of dawn washed the river silver, Antonio stepped outside alone for a moment and watched the city wake. He felt in his chest a new calibration, equal parts fear and hope. He had given away tangible power, and in return had been handed the more precarious authority of trust. It would not be an easy tenure, and it would cost him more than he had yet counted. He returned to the bakery and closed the door gently behind him, as if not to wake anything sacred. The three of them sat, a small constellation of lives that had collided and somehow, against the weight of old codes, chosen one another. The world beyond would keep its rules. Inside, they would make new ones. Antonio picked up a small coin from the counter, the talisman he had once pressed into the envelope, and slid it into Elena's palm. No debts, no obligations. Just a circle closed. Elena held it for a moment, then pressed the coin to Mateo's forehead like a benediction. They sat together in the warm, yeast-sweet air as dawn unrolled over the river. Outside, the city argued with itself. Inside, a family learned, slowly and stubbornly, how to answer the day. The oven cooled to embers, and the simple scent of bread and forgiven mistakes rose into the morning like smoke from a hearth, ordinary, resilient, and quietly miraculous.